Welcome back. If you will permit me to indulge in a bit of a metaphor, hardcore RLCraft runs are a bit like growing up in the 1500s. Most runs and moments after they begin to circumstances that are deeply unfair and are entirely incapable of being dealt with. Survival is often more of a matter of luck than a lack of skill or care, and the default assumption is that you won't. Survive, that is. Following that metaphor, this world is probably about 6 in human years, and has matured enough that most of the immediately lethal threats are largely mitigatable or no longer present. So I'm ready to begin taking my first steps as a proper young child in this wonderfully unfair world. Namely, by exploiting turbo-stupid amounts of power creep. That's right, it's time to get stacking. A little bit of luck in crafting gets me Masterwork Dragon Scale leggings and boots, so that part is out of the way. Mending books are pretty much unobtainable still, so they will just sit in a chest until I'm ready to enchant them. My little lava run back home also happened to find me a broken heart charm. I'm of the opinion that this thing is not terribly good, but anything that can be a threat to me right now is going to be enough of a threat that a little bit more effective HP will not go amiss, so I'm gonna wear it anyway. My initial bit of power creep is to pay a visit to the local blacksmith and steal their hot rocks with my Silk Touch Matic. Hot rocks, combined with spicy bone meal and some costume jewelry, let me create 2 potion rings that grant a permanent strength buff when worn. And they stack, giving me a straight +6 attack damage to anything I hit with. Very nice. Potion rings also happen to be one of those items that can take on both kinds of modifiers, and they also happen to be re-rollable with gold ingots. Re-rolling their quality into Undying, with additional health bonuses and damage resistances, and re-rolling their modifier to something with effective HP, like more hearts or more armor, then turns these into a very substantial defense and offense upgrade for very little cost to myself. With those done, I take a quick trip out to shoot down another Sky Rat. RNGesus chose to bless me on this day and gave me a dragon with a terminal case of brain rot. I can count on one hand how many times this thing even seemed to notice that I existed, with several feathers left over, so it's safe to say that this was an easy mark. Rather than skin this one for scales that wouldn't work for upgrading any of my armor, I smelt up some bottles and juiced the thing like an orange, netting myself 6 dragon juice, and head on back home. My new weapon of choice is a flaming dragon bone saber. With strength buffs and enchantments that directly add a significant amount of damage to the weapon, base DPS starts being largely unimportant, and the only relevant stat is its attack speed and any special modifiers it gets. My chosen option, the Saber, has a quick attack, is one-handed, and as such enables my crippling addiction to hiding behind a shield, and Sabers also have a passive 25% damage reduction effect that supposedly redirects damage taken to the sword, which if I understand correctly will make me even tankier when holding the thing. To be quite honest, I am not entirely sure I've ever seen this effect in action, but I will take the game's word for it. I will no doubt end up upgrading the thing some more in the future, but for now I just slap a throwaway enchantment on it and call it a day. I don't really have enough XP to do anything else, and I will be shocked if this particular weapon survives long enough for it to be relevant. Regarding the XP problem, let's change that. I take a brief layover to finish up some unfinished extermination work, visiting massive environmental damage in the process, and then hoof it to my next destination, which is one of those rare, dubiously existent battle towers, complete with angry sea snake, which I should probably do something about. Oh, I'm sorry, did I say 1 angry sea snake? I actually meant 2. My bad. Fortunately for me, sea snakes universally suffer from a terminal case of can't think their way out of a paper bag, and the first one manages to get itself stuck on a local ice floe. Rather than slide off the ice floe and, swim in the ocean that's right there, it instead tries to very slowly wiggle its way towards me while I pepper it with arrows. So, 1 down. The second one seems to forget the difference between water and not water, and attempts to ignore the former and swim in the latter, getting itself stuck on a wall in the process, thus giving me the opportunity to fill it full of arrows. I actually thought I secured the kill here early, so when I went down to grab the scales, it got a chance to try and swipe right, which was thwarted by my absolutely spanking tanking ability. No, bad snake, sit, stay, play handbag. Good snake. With all that fun out of the way, let's get battle towering. I am absolutely stacked relative to the threat level that these things pose, so I decide to just knock on the door with a big stick. I do call it quits right before I'm ready to open the last 2 loot chests, though. For those of you who haven't fought a battle tower before, the boss activates when you either enter the final floor of the tower or try to open the chest on the final floor or the floor preceding it. So while the boss is alive and in the area, you really won't be able to loot those chests. This is largely intended to be an anti-cheese tactic, since you could just zoom up and grab the loot otherwise, but there also happens to be about a bazillion ways of bypassing it, including just using the boss itself to break the chests and loot them that way. Items in RLCraft are immune to most kinds of environmental damage, including lava, fire, and explosions, but I can't be bothered to sift through the ashes of a fallen battle tower to decide which kind of pants I feel like taking home, so I take the time here to indulge in a little bit of hopper cheese. Chest clicking activates the boss, but hopper clicking does not. As long as you're careful to place the hopper on the side of a block under the chest and not on the chest bottom directly, you can then just loot everything from the hopper, no problem. If the chest happens to be locked, you can also click the lock and pick it without aggroing the boss, and then just place the hopper after it's been picked. It is totally unnecessary, since the battle tower boss is basically a pushover, but I prefer to be neat about this sort of thing and didn't feel like cleaning up my mess after. After taking my time and picking over the loot, the boss goes down like a chump, and I walk away quite a bit more loaded down with useful crafting materials and a couple of nice baubles. Nice and clean, just how I like it. With the powers of Walmart Poseidon combined with just about any kind of depth strider, any body of water is basically just my domain now, and there isn't a whole lot mobs can do to stop me. Case in point, I just casually stop and have a little sea serpent snack right outside an underwater temple I was looting for no reason other than that I felt like it. The underwater temple was nice because Elder Guardians drop vitamins, which make you immune to weakness and mining fatigue, and they are a crafting ingredient for an endgame item called an Ankh Shield that I'm going to want to secure at some point. In pursuit of solving the seasonal shift problem, I spent the better part of half an hour farming out the materials for an Aussie chestplate liner, in the process wreaking havoc on the local ecology. Aussie gear is worn underneath your armor, and is essentially a giant no thank you button for any and all temperature-related nonsense. This is something I would have had much earlier if I'd access to any amount of slime whatsoever, but I didn't because I could not find a single stinking battle tower before winter hit. Since my current chestplate is pretty much going to be permanent, I feel that it's well worth an Aussie liner, so I chuck that on and then bask in my ability to do literally anything without freezing or burning to death in 5 seconds. I also scraped together enough experience for magic level 32, which is enough to unlock the use of a magic mirror that I found in my earlier battle tower. Magic mirrors are essentially infinite use free teleports to a spawn point, which is normally supposed to be your bed, but I use waystones so much that it usually goes to a random waystone. In addition to being able to have a nice get out of jail free card that activates in about 2 seconds, they are just incredibly useful utility items and save me a bunch of swimming time, and I'm very glad to have them. It may not look it, but I'm only a few hours shy of completely obliterating anything marginally resembling game balance in this mod pack. I'm not quite ready, though. Before I can really start taking the power train down the tracks, I need a little bit more XP to make myself some decent tools. Oh look, there's some XP now! And now we do a little enchanting, well, more like a lot of enchanting, but I end up with a decent pickaxe and shovel out of the deal, so who's counting? It is not going to matter soon, anyway. This is also where I learned that I've maxed out the number of hearts I can get from heart containers, so there's going to be no more easy HP buffs for me. That's fine. It doesn't matter. While I collect some necessary materials for deploying massive game-breaking nonsense, let's dust off the old soapbox for a bit. RLCraft is a dungeon crawler. The recurring theme all the way into the endgame progression arc is remarkably consistent with this fact, and the game is designed so that in a normal playthrough, your success is directly linked to how well you can extract loot and XP from dungeons. And in doing so, it largely ignores other options and technology. The meat of the mod pack is this core gameplay loop of stab things, get stronger, stab slightly stronger things, and in the process take more than a few extra dirt naps. This is great if you're willing to engage in this whole shank and be shanked ecosystem, but this is a hardcore world, so I cannot do that. Yes, I may be stupidly overpowered, and yes, I may habitually deploy the stinkiest cheese in my arsenal, but none of those are guarantees that I will survive. So if I went this route, eventually something would get lucky, and the amount of overpowered I would need to be to completely eliminate that risk is just not possible to get if I also want to keep playing softball with my dungeon encounters. At the core of this problem is my general lack of easy XP sources and the difficulty I will have getting enchantments. The really, really good enchantments are nearly impossible to get from an enchanting table because of how expensive they are to make and refine. I could try and set up a massive village breeding complex, since villagers can rarely sell them, but for the most part, the game expects you to steal them off of pre-enchanted gear that you loot from high-tier dungeons. Both of these options kind of suck. The first one because it would require days of breeding and farming and trading in a pre-village and pillage version of the game, and the second because it will eventually end up Thanos snapping my world as a direct consequence of a mob snapping my spine. With those two options eliminated, the only real choice I have is to somehow generate a stupid amount of experience and loot at relatively low risk to myself. Problem is, the game is explicitly engineered to prevent this. Spawners destroy themselves, Lycanite mob farms have gotten repeatedly nerfed into the ground and weren't really ever all that good anyway, and every low-cost, low-effort, low-risk XP generation option is either terrible or was patched out ages ago. You know, except the obvious ones that no one ever seems to think about. I don't know what it is about Minecraft in particular, but modders and pack devs inevitably seem to forget that vanilla Minecraft already has a bunch of staggeringly powerful technologies just baked into the game that need to be balanced around. This is such a common trend that I just kind of mentally refer to it as the vanilla blind spot, and my first pass attempt at breaking literally any mod pack is always just asking myself what sort of wacky hijinks I can get up to using nothing but vanilla technology. RLCraft, and the people who try and design enchantment and XP farms in it, are no exception to this rule. Everyone seems to focus on nerfing spawners or nerfing mob farms or finding a way around nerfed spawner and mob farm designs, all while falling to the same vanilla blind spot and settling for some truly dog-tier production speed in the process. This pack deserves a better class of mob farm. Like, say, for instance, a bog-standard zero-effort guardian farm that has been around since ocean temples were a thing. Don't get me wrong, I respect the heck out of the people who figured out other farming options. They saw a problem, and instead of whining about how unfair or unbalanced it was, they sat themselves down, did their research, and fixed it in an environment where there was probably not a whole lot of good information or established precedent to draw off of. The world really could use more people like that. But if the goal was just to make XP and not to push the envelope of RLCraft tech, why bother reinventing the wheel? Single-player Minecraft is super forgiving when it comes to mob farms, and when you don't have to deal with whatever special cocktail of performance-enhancing nonsense a server is running that keeps dropping your spawn rates through the subfloor, you really don't even need to get fancy with them. A little aside, the game blessed me with a Fortune 2 Mending Stone Axe. On the face of it, this is useless because disenchanting this would not give me the Mending enchantment. But what I can do is enchant a different stone axe with Silk Touch and then combine this axe with that one. Since Fortune and Silk Touch conflict, the end result would be a Mending Silk Touch stone axe with Mending on top because Fortune was deleted. Essentially, this is a free mending book and forms the basis of how I will be ripping off mending enchantments from a whole bunch of loot further down the line. With that little aside out of the way, let's get building. Generally, when people show the full process of building a guardian farm, they start by breaking down the temple and boxing up the sides. There are good reasons for doing it in this order in vanilla. Most of the efficient water draining methods require slimestone, which struggles to function if there's a temple in the way, and it functions a little bit too well if there isn't something to catch it before it carves a trench into the ocean out to your render limit. In vanilla, guardians also pose basically zero threat to a player, so it doesn't really matter if they're attacking you when you're containing and breaking down the temple. This is not the case in RLCraft. I would prefer not to swim with hostile mobile sea urchins for an hour or two that it would take to break down and wall up the temple, and I have exactly 4 slime balls to my name. So I'm going to be using a bit of a different approach that starts with building a temporary roof over the entire spawning area of the set piece. Out of dirt, because it's a solid block that's easy to break and is, dirt cheap. This does have the unfortunate side effect of upping the spawn rate of guardians underneath it by a factor of 10, but that's fine, they can't see me through solid blocks. With a roof in place, I can then make walls, which I do by cramming a bunch of sand in a slit on the side of the dirt ceiling that I measured out earlier. There's really not much to say here, it's a wall made out of sand. Nothing much interesting happens during this process, so I got bored and decided to experiment a bit. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a sea serpent wandered into a swarm of guardians? I sure did, so I spanked the local sea snake and lured it in. Sadly, guardians and sea snakes appear to get along just fine, despite sea serpents supposedly being hostile to everything, so I ended up just baiting it out on top of the farm, using my foot, and dealing with it the old-fashioned way. And done. I now have the world's angriest sandcastle. Now what? Well, now I deploy my secret weapon. Adult beverages. Rustic has a whole branch of the mod dedicated to brewing and fermenting drinks of the mature variety in a semi-realistic manner from various vanilla and mod-added fruits and berries that you can find around the world. Some of these are very, very strong, both in the adult capacity and in the game balancing capacity, and endgame builds almost always at least dabble in their production. I'm no exception, but for today I'm more concerned about the more child-friendly precursor fluids that can be generated with this mod. In one of those stories as old as time, nobody seems to really be able to come to a common consensus on what should happen when 2 fluids, particularly modded ones, interact with each other in Minecraft. They can't really mix, because that's not how the game works, so usually what happens is one of 3 things. They can either do what vanilla and certain lycanite fluids do, which is form a thematically appropriate block at the point of contact. They can do what lycanite fluids also do, which is just treat the block as another fluid but otherwise not react with it. Or they can do what rustic grape juice does, which just straight up deletes water entirely and does not let it flow back in. In the words of the #1 contributor to childhood obesity, "Oh yeah!" Of course, I want to do this with as little grape juice as possible, because do I look like a lemonade stand to you? So I start by deploying an entire row of grape juice on the bottom of my farm. Once this first line is done, I can then walk back a second line of grape juice, taking the place of the first, and dig out the blocks underneath the first line. This lets me pull the first line of grape juice back behind the second line, dig out the blocks behind the second line, and continue, allowing flowing grape juice to continue holding back the water still in the farm. You may not like it, but this is what peak engineering looks like in RLCraft. I know Scrape and Run is in this mod pack, but maybe the real parasite is what I became along the way. With all that inconvenient ancient cultural heritage cleared out of the way, you are then free to remove the grape juice and store it for your next mega project. You won't be needing it anymore. Enjoy watching all the helpless guardians flop around like the fish that they are. My temple happened to have a bunch of empty space underneath it, which could potentially spawn mobs and eat up some of the mob cap. I'm not going to worry too much about the mob cap loss from local cave systems, but once I put in the water chute, there's going to be a giant dead space underneath it that could make a difference, so I do want to fill this back in with something. This is easily solved by the power of blue oobleck. Lycanite fluids, when falling onto water, turn it into a bunch of different kinds of thematically appropriate blocks. Blue oobleck, or ooze, if you want to call it by its proper name, in particular makes packed ice, but all of them will work. This lets me patch up all the holes under the Guardian farm for cheap, since I can just fill the hole with water and freeze it up with oobleck. Terraforming made easy. I am even able to exploit my blue Play-Doh fluid to speed up the water slide construction process a lot, and by sheer coincidence, the color scheme of whatever random junk I had in my inventory happened to match very well with packed ice from the frozen water layers. This mob farm actually looks like I intended it to be aesthetically pleasing. Neat. That is not at all what happened, and I would have been just as happy to build the thing out of dirt, but I will take the miracles as they come. It's a pity that this part isn't ever visible. What's that? Aesthetically pleasing mob farms in my playthrough? We can't have that. Better cover up the whole thing with another layer of dirt. Nope, still not ugly enough. Need to break up the nice smooth dirt. How can I possibly make this thing uglier? I know, let's replace the dirt with fence gates. And it just so happens I have a whole backpack of them here. How incredibly convenient. And done. Nice and poop-colored. Now we just cover it all up with more poop-colored blocks, flood the whole thing with water this time instead of grape juice, break all of the poop blocks that we just placed, and cover the whole thing up again with something that mobs won't spawn on. This definitely didn't take 9 hours of collection, excavation, flooding, anti-flooding, and building to do. No siree. But it is done. Let's go take a look, shall we? Yeah, this'll do just fine. For the record, this is the absolute worst possible Guardian farm you could make, by the way. I put in the literal bare minimum amount of effort I needed to get this thing to function, and it shows. I do know how to build good ones, it just doesn't matter in this instance because this thing is already going to be far more XP and resources than I'm ever going to need. After a quick pit stop to stock up on storage options, repair materials, and farming implements, I get to work. And immediately realize that I messed up the build. My spawn rates are way too low. Think back to the steps I showed you. Can you spot the mistake I made? Let's make a copy of the world so I can demonstrate. Guardians have special rules that determine how they spawn, but because of how their dungeon works, the rules have a few quirks that don't normally show up with other mobs. One of those quirks is that any Guardian spawn attempt that happens in a water block that can see the sky has a 90% chance of failing, because if it didn't, the ocean would be overrun with these things. Slabs, including jungle slabs, which I built the roof of the Guardian farm out of, despite being opaque to the eyes of the player and capable of blocking light, are not actually considered by Minecraft to be sky occluding, which is something I did not catch until now. In my haste to get the farm done, I forgot a step in the process that would have layered on and then frozen a second sheet of water over the first one in the ceiling, using ooze, which would have then formed that opaque layer that I could put slabs on. That one difference means my mob farm is probably running at around 1/10 of its total production capacity, and the real production rate should be something like this. There are a number of very simple ways to fix this problem, but as is typical, I chose the ugliest and laziest one. I just wang a bunch of water on top of the flabs, freeze it over with my menthol-flavored Kool-Aid, and slam down some more water on top of that new packed ice layer to keep the mob spawns down. It can still spawn Lycanite mobs, because Lycanite mobs don't give a rat's rear end about normal spawning limiters, but I'm also surrounded by an ocean, so that's not any different than normal. Fun fact, I actually made one of these things in an RLCraft server once. I took the time to give it on-off controls, gave it a toggle to control how many mobs could spawn, made it not look like a frosty ocean turd, all that good stuff. This is not that server. Mob cramming will kill the Guardians before the Guardians kill my computer, and I'm the only one who has to look at the thing. All mobs, no frills, no anti-lag measures. It is a frosted turd on a tube. How do you like that, Shabaxi? It is admittedly really struggling with the mob cap, but that's a change I can make never if I ever need to fix it. Point remains, my XP problems are now solved forever. That isn't the only problem that this farm solves, though. Having such a high concentration of mobs means that I have an equally high concentration of infernal, champion, and boss mobs, all conveniently trapped and possessing of a super low HP. Most of the infernal and champion drops aren't really all that useful anymore, though I do amass a nice retirement fund of spectral silt and glowing ingots. The real treasure is the hundreds upon hundreds of random enchantment books that I get. And I do mean hundreds. And random. Case in point, I'm now the proud owner of enough stupidly stacked enchantments to start crafting my endgame weapon, despite having literally not even explored 3/4 of what this game has to offer. Oh, and also, like, all the XP levels. While this farm does solve the XP and enchanting problem, I am far from done with world exploration or dungeon crawling. By its nature, enchanted book farming is random, which is great for getting one-off super rare enchantments, but is less great at getting the 500,000 mending books I need for enchanting everything. And it does absolutely nothing to help with bauble acquisition and armor upgrade. All of that requires exploration and grand larceny, so let's get started. Help! Step serpent! I'm stuck in a mountain! Whatever shall I do? My first major target of opportunity is an ocean-going lycanite dungeon. While the loot isn't usually fantastic, the dungeon has a lot of chests in it that can be mimics, and sometimes it does have interesting enchanted books. I almost immediately scrapped this idea, because lycanite mobs are stupid, and some of them give you potion effects that entirely invalidate your armor. Incidentally, this is the first time in this run where the broken art has validated itself in my eyes. I will absolutely be using this thing in the future. It saved my run. If nothing else, that close shave did remind me that I need to reroll my baubles, so I make sure to do that and stack up a bunch of extra HP in the process. Soon after, I suffer something of a minor setback in that a lycanite event called Eruption happens while I am inside my house. I was under the impression that I could just wait it out in a wood house, and that assumption was proven incorrect as my house burns down around me. No worries, I was just going to go take down some dragons so I can just chug some fire resistance and plug the holes with something non-flammable. I don't care about the house per se, I just like that it's an enclosed area near a waystone, so this is not particularly traumatic for me. This plan is fine until some over-leveled lycanite mob attacks me and breaks through my natural HP and armor, my undershirt passive, and then most of my broken heart HP, dropping me down to nearly dead with one swipe. Lycanite mobs are stupid. I escape and hoof it to my guardian farm to heal up and regenerate the broken hearts. That village is probably a goner, but I have been wanting to migrate all my stuff over to underneath the guardian farm, so that's fine. After digging myself out a hole to dump my items, I warp into my old village and approach on foot, since I have no idea what I'm going to find there. This place looks like it took a trip downstairs in a handbasket, and several buildings, including my own, are merrily burning away, but there really isn't that many mobs, and despite looking bad, the damage is pretty cosmetic. Chests don't burn, so my stuff is fine, and I don't really care about the rest of it. The only thing I lost of any value whatsoever was the bookcases on my enchanting setup. Transferring the items didn't take all that long, especially with the number of movement speed buffs that I can stack for water travel, so without further ado, welcome to the Prismarine Panic Prison. It's a box made out of Prismarine, because that's what I had right outside my guardian farm. High-class living right here. I even took the time to make a waystone for it so I can teleport directly into it instead of relying on ocean-going travel, because that seems like a recipe for getting my butt munched. Alright, that nonsense out of the way. What was I doing? Oh, right. Hunting sky rats. If you'll recall, back to my mining turtle phase, I chanced upon a dragon den and managed to get screamed at by the local lizard. Since I never actually saw the thing, there's a chance that it could be a tier 5, and I know for a fact that it's a fire dragon because I saw the den. If it is a tier 5, I can then use its skull to craft a bauble that gives a permanent fire resistance buff, so I definitely want to take the thing down. Even if it isn't a tier 5, dragon dens have a huge number of chests in them, which makes hunting for mimics quick and easy, so all in all, it seems like an excellent place to start. After plumbing the depths of my old mineshaft, I was able to use my atlas to identify a rough location where the dragon should be on the surface. I went back up and started digging down to try and pop a hole in the nest from above, and apparently that's all it takes to tick one of these things off, since the dragon screamed bloody murder, tore a hole out from the ground miles away from where I expected it to, and then started ripping apart the local terrain in a tizzy. So, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that my dragon is thick, and is definitely a tier 5. The bad news is that my dragon is also a foodie. I am stuck in the middle of a mountainous alpine forest, and this absolute raging dipstick lizard can't seem to keep her attention on me for more than 3 seconds before flapping off and toasting herself a sheep. This makes keeping contact with her practically impossible, and I lose her for about 5 bolts after my first engagement. I did find some netherwort in a half-roasted set piece nearby, though, so that was nice. After a solid 15 minutes of trying to track down my useless reptile, it turned out she was busy having a snack on the other side of the mountain range, and the fight is on again. Well, if by fight you mean me fighting through the underbrush while the dragon just casually chows down on anything that moves within a 500 block radius, in the process regenerating what little damage I'm able to do to her during the process. Meanwhile, I get stuck in tree cover and bogged down by every stupid monster in creation trying to throw hands. This, of course, means that Mrs. Short Attention Span Theater buggers off again, forcing me to play Where's Waldo in the middle of a burning forest. After a quick resupply for ammo and more fire resistance potions, I again spent another day tracking down Dingles the Doofus, who apparently was flirting with local dragons in her area. After showing her tail for about 5 seconds, she flapped off over a mountain range or two and forced me to chase her down a 3rd time, without even giving me a chance to engage. Lady Braincakes finally slows down to snack on some pork chops, and this proves to be her undoing. Her snacking habits placed her on the top of a rocky hill with relatively little cover, and between that and a local river, I was able to maintain contact long enough to land a bunch of clean shots. I am using diamond bolts on a power 4 legendary crossbow, so even tier 5 dragons don't really have that much staying power compared to how much damage I can dish out with this thing. And she eventually went down. After a 40-minute fight that passed through 5 different biomes, incinerated half of them and ate the other half. The one good thing to come out of this was that Miss Snacks-a-Lot was, in fact, a miss, and a tier 5 miss at that, which means that not only do I get my tier 5 fire dragon skull, I also got 2 dragon eggs for my trouble. Which, in retrospect, does explain the chronic munchies. Her stash is not particularly interesting, I didn't get any mimics, and normal dragon loot isn't super useful, but it was still worth checking. Things are gonna start getting a lot more interesting now that I'm building up my endgame gear. Thanks to Flappy the Mutton Muncher, I now have a charm that grants permanent fire resistance and night vision, which effectively replaces the Ring of Enchanted Eyes and the heaping scads of fire resistance that I was chugging beforehand. This is something I consider to be a necessary part of my endgame build, and is very nice to have done early. My next task will be looting dungeons for more baubles, and trying to secure the last handful of mending books I need for my assault on the end. All things that will hopefully happen in the next episode. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.